opportunity to talk about stuff that that you're particularly interested in. I mean, the idea was, I put in what might or bring up what might seem like these very far out examples of developmental processes, and then trying to think about how learning comes into it. And I can never really tell when people are following it or not. And I think the test is whether or not they find the metaphors or a particular analytic thing useful in just like how to think about things. So your project, you're now doing like, you consider the first round of what you were doing pilot, so a pilot study, so to speak, an initial getting to know and working with people. How far do you think you are in this trajectory of what you're doing?
Sure. But since three of us, I mean, and we have similar interests and research, I would love to hear also Ivana's project. And I want to learn more about it, and same as yours, Mike, new ideas. Just the background information, quick background information. I have been implementing this formative intervention and adapted model of change laboratory, boundary crossing laboratory, Urios work. And I have been doing this one since 2011. And
hi, Eddie. Hi.
Hi, Eddie.
Hi, Eddie.
Hey, how's it going?
It's a small group. It's a good, rich conversation. Eddie. I hope you can join us. I was just giving a small background information about my work, but please feel free to join us.
Okay, thank you.
Based on your interest, your research project, I want to learn more about too. So, Mike, so shortly 2011, since 2011, I have been implementing these model laboratories called Learning Lab. And Learning Lab is focused on racial disparities in school discipline actions and placement in special education for students, Black and brown students for behavioral disorders, what I call the racialization of behavioral problems. Okay. And it's a national issue, it's a historical issue, it's a very complex issue. I conceptualize as what Urios is calling runaway object. So I think my work is based on the Urios conceptualization, research conceptualization. It's like a fourth generation, because I have funded from Wisconsin Department of Education, school districts funded this project, university funded this project. We built a coalition in the beginning, Urban League, Centro Hispano, and several other, YMCA, YWCA. And what I did in the first phase, I analyzed the state's data, and I'm still doing that, quantitative analysis of the school and student level data to show the patterns and predictors of racial disproportionality, how it's actualized, how it's realized in local context. Then move to the second phase. Again, this has been going on for 10 years, so it's continuous analysis. Second phase, we selected 4 schools, and we implemented learning labs in 3 schools. So I designed this framework because Urios' work and others' work were mostly focusing on the organizational effectiveness. Our work is a school setting, which is very political, very complex institute. And what we did actually, instead of focusing on one school context, we just put the school at the center, but district, family, community, and civic organizations to support that transformation. And our focus was to bring our intervention was aiming to bring the historically marginalized communities into decision-making process. So what we did actually, we utilize the crack you're describing is for us the hacking the policies. At schools, they have been implementing this school-wide intervention process to increase the school's inclusivity, address the behavioral problems, so forth and so on. They call PBIS, RTI. Those are federally supported intervention models, but they never consider culture, they never consider race as an element. They were very linear interventions. So, but every school, almost every school in Wisconsin were implementing. So we got into that system. So they built teams and everything. We open up that decision-making process to students, family members, community members. So the paper I share is a high school case. It's an urban high school. It's one of the original 3 learning labs. And over there, we had the African-American parents, community members, Latinx students, and the parents, as well as the paraprofessionals, professionals, administrators. They got together an academic year, started analyzing the system outcomes, then move into the system, then design a new system, behavioral support system, to provide better behavioral support for their students to and idea was that they are going to implement that new system next year, next academic year, which they did, but we didn't study the implementation. So currently we have 5 learning labs in Florida, and 1 learning lab in Wisconsin, active learning lab. In Wisconsin Learning Lab, the project I told you about, what we call indigenous learning lab, we implemented learning lab in the city where there are 20% of the city high school, rural high school, serving 20% Native American students for Ojibwe Nation. So they had a very disproportionate outcomes. There's a very tenacious history of racial disparities over there, and anti-Indian movement is very strong. That's the center of KKK, that's the center of white supremacist movement, and there are lots of, even recently they were shooting Native American peoples last week. And this is a very contentious issue. So what we did actually last year, and this past academic year, we formed the group. We have the Native American family members, community members, students. We had 3 students. They got together and they designed a new system, analyzed the existing system's outcomes, map out the existing system, developed the culture responsive or ideal system, their utopia, but based on the existing system. So this year we are working with them, this coming year, we are working with them to implement the design. As you know, in the prior formative interventions, usually people stay at the design base. Implementation was usually checked through follow-up interviews, which we have been doing so far. But with this project, we are moving from design, then working with them to implementation, and the 3rd year is going to be sustainability. So again, what we do is like a guerrilla kind of funding. So we patchwork the fundings, small fundings from there, small fundings over here, and we are just applying to Spencer to get some support to this implementation. So this is what I've been doing. And so basically, this learning lab is, what I'm studying is how multiple stakeholders with different interests, often opposing goals and histories, can come together and engage in future making, engage in systemic analysis, and change their school system. My whole idea is this. I mean, we can do this one at the margins. What happens if we interest conversion? The administrators, research team, community come together and design the new school for them. So that's my project, Mike.
Wow. That's certainly a utopian project, right? They want to create the perfect school for them, which is right. Let's make it really nice for us. And you have, so you have sort of corporate representation through civic, whatever the civic groups are that are working with you. You have the YMCA, you have the after school type community in there. You have churches in there as well.
In one school, yes. So those communities are determined by the school staff. I said, who are you working with? So I didn't bring them any kind of prescribed, what I say, those kind of communities can be a good resource. In one elementary school, so far we have implemented Learning Lab at 7 schools, and 4 of them are research projects. Others were just efforts, districts' efforts to scale up the learning labs.
And so, when you do a learning lab, you do it basically on the script that URIA uses in the change labs?
That's why I called it Learning Lab. This is different, Mike. So in the first project, I designed this framework called Cultural Responsive PBS. Again, PBS is the federal initiative, and cultural responsiveness are my take on to just hack the system. So I designed that framework, but I didn't want to publish that framework before I test and refine. So we implemented those models at the elementary school, and the name of the elementary school, pseudonym, of course, the Cole Elementary School, after your name. So we have the Rogoff Middle School, Cole Elementary School. We had the Erickson Middle School, High School, and we had Scribner Elementary School. They were original pack. So what we did actually in the Cole Elementary School, we formed this group, Mike, and followed the URIO's work, Change Laboratory. But we stuck somewhere.
Who was the group? What was the group you started with there?
That was the elementary school, suburban place. And
who? The staff?
We start with the principal and the vice principal and their PBIS coach. That's the official status. And then we start, we say who you want to work with. These are going to be not focus groups. These are going to be your work partners. And they decide to take the learning lab to combine their academic intervention at school and behavioral intervention at school. There's a school-wide intervention called RTI and school-wide intervention called PBS. So they invited the head of those committees. They invited the paraprofessionals like playground attendants. They invited the community members, and they had only one black teacher at that district, and they invited her as the like multicultural teacher, whatever it is. But again, we told them, we are not over here to police, we are not over here to give you solutions, we are not giving you an outcome, but process. We implemented that, but group was 35 people, Mike. We had refugee parents, we have the parents who are experiencing homelessness because it was after the 2008 financial crisis. So they were experiencing lots of homelessness. They had white families experiencing homelessness. They invited them, we said perfect. And we started to teach them about the triangles, all of those things. It didn't work well. We were, then we tried to facilitate the problem identification following the Urios model. Somehow we couldn't adapt it well in this context because issue was race, very contentious issue, right? I have been studying race in the United States. So what we did actually, we stuck over there, Mike. One school year passed and they were stuck at the problem identification. Do you remember Urios' work, The Cycle of Change? We formed a group, they started questioning, and they did the analyzing, historical and empirical analysis. They prepared data and everything, but they couldn't move to modeling. So that summer came. At that time, we were just starting the ethnographic work. Before the learning labs, we studied those schools 6 months. We didn't do it elementary school, but the middle school and high school, we were studying. So my students were doing ethnographic work. So in that summer in California, I was reading Bowker and Starr, and then Freire. And Freire was talking about how transformation starts here and now. And I noticed that in the model, my interpretation of the change laboratory never had here and now. They had the primary stimulus, they were collecting data. We didn't do that. I didn't want to do that. I want people to bring it in the table. I didn't want to interview the clients, then present as a researcher to the group. I didn't want to do it. So we had these parents already, we had the community members. Why don't we have them over there? But we couldn't move them. So I developed this model called modeling. So modeling was, Mike, we just tell the people what you do, tell us. I'm sure in the prior change laboratories, they do that, but we asked the group, how do you manage the behaviors? Very simple. If Eddie is a new teacher going to a classroom and Aydin is acting out, what is Eddie supposed to do? No one mapped out before the school's behavioral support system. It was in their heads, but very different portions, right? Parents were seeing the different parts of the system, and the other one, students were seeing different teachers, so forth and so on. So idea was that making invisible visible through mapping. So they map out, it's a flow charts, and we applied that model in that process in Raghav Middle School, then the MLK High School. Now we are implementing everywhere because that helps us to move the group from individual tensions, experiences, histories, analysis to collective problem solving. Once they map out, they have some kind of artifact. They can put all of those ideas, concerns, histories in that artifact. And that artifact helped them to also alienate themselves, like distance and effect, Brecht used to call. Like they said, oh, this is the system. And they start to see themselves puzzle the system from the teacher's perspective, family perspective. So gradually they expand that existing system map. As they are doing that, they start to generate ideas. And we ask them to develop the ideal system, but now they have an artifact to refer to. So that's why it's different than change laboratory. That's why I call it a learning lab. So in the beginning, it was a change laboratory. And along the way, I met with Yurio 2015. And it was a great experience for me. I mean, he was so humble, he was so nice, and he was so supportive and helpful. So he was one of our consultants along with Annalisa. We had the Gloria Lassen-Billings and Alfredo Artiles just help us with this, guide us in this process. But it was great. So we had the learning lab process. Now we have the questioning, examining, analyzing. Then we move that with the mapping to the modeling. So we developed a new expensive action. But again, everything tested out, refined in the process. So we are still testing it, changing. Yeah.
Wow. It's a huge project.
Yeah. How do you manage that? I am working on something on a much smaller scale.
What do you work on, Ivana?
No. Let's not move to my thing yet. I'm just very interested in, because I see all these contradictions between what in your case it's different stakeholders or these different groups. For me, it's much smaller.
Yeah.
But there's so many contradictions and so many issues that are systemic. They just kind of emerge in a conversation, a group conversation over a table, as misunderstandings or as just so I wonder, how do you manage all that? How do you go about creating that transformation, because it takes a lot of time, and what is important is to bring everybody sort of to understand each other's perspective as a baseline, basically.
Right.
And that takes years. So people understand where the other people are coming from. So I'm just very interested in how do you go about that process of bringing people on the same page, because you have so many of these moving parts.
Right. Sort of like the Regen project itself, right?
Yes. So I was
kind of like the Regen project,
Absolutely.
because we had all these different points of view and people of different ages, different experiences. They didn't know each other very well.
What's the Regen project, Mike? Could you tell me a little bit more?
Well, it's what sort of ended up generating the class. That is, the project began 2 years ago, and the idea was to bring together sort of senior people like Luis and myself and Ray McDermott and Carol Lee, but people who were involved in chat and civil rights era kind of involvement, and who were the mentors of the teachers, directly or indirectly, of many junior people of color, because all of us were focused on trying to increase the diversity in the groups we were working in as a condition of doing the work. You can't. Anyway, so the whole story about how we had to work with and find people in the community who would work with us and who could trust us, and then set up a system in the lab where I didn't control the money. People got money and they each had their own domain. And then we came together in the lab as a whole around the common methodological problems. And then sometimes people would invite other people into their domain, come see this or do that. And that was the sort of, working out a strategy. It's level playing field stuff that we've been talking about here with the Prolepsis Design Studios for more than 2 years, I think.
Yeah.
Long time. 3 years maybe. So, so you're just a part of a general process of change and right in there doing it. It's amazing what you say to me about people just do the design part and then don't do the intervention. But I mean, the thing is that people do the intervention for 2 years and then stop. So, and then say whether or not it worked. And I don't think that's right either, so. I mean, we just learn too much from keep on going until you find you can't go any further, but you understand so much more about what all the problems were than you did when you started. Andy, how are you? We'll come back to all of this because I understand a lot better now. It'd be really interesting, for example, to see an early learning lab when you bring people together, because the Regen brought together critical learning sciences people, primarily people of color, who've already got their own virtual lab stuff going and everything, but they're students of myself and all these other people who started off this way of thinking in the United States. And I think the real issue for us was, how do we solve all the contradictions of rank, ethnicity, gender, national origin, all of that stuff as people come into the room. And the senior people sort of trusted each other. The middle level people had been burned too often getting caught in a white person's project. So they were a little suspicious, and they taught their students really well. You correct me, Eddie, if I'm wrong about this. They taught their students really well about how to be a person who knows the skills you need to know, but your own person, and dealing with the problems you're going to work with on your own grounds. with your own concerns in mind. And it's just, that's what I was bringing that together. And in the first meeting, there was everybody was polite and the work got done, but a lot of feelings got hurt. There was sort of unexpected things happened. There was not nearly enough time. People had to leave early, but it limped into a next stage. And then there was a lot of sort of, am I being accurate here, Eddie, or am I going off here? Does this sound familiar?
No, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That sounds good. The picture
Okay,
of
and then
what.
there's a lot of sort of undergrad people checking with each other, and we had planned it only for a year, but it was insane. I mean, I did it because it was a conference. We got money to string it out to 2 conferences, and we wanted to use it for this critical rebuilding of trust really across the generations and acceptance of the diversity and the need for the 2 to get together. So I was coming in saying chat needs critical learning sciences. And I think the big deal was to convince anybody that learning sciences needed anything from chat. But they were all using it. But there was this racially at bottom, but it wasn't just race. Race, gender was a big issue in it also. Just an acceptance of broad acceptance of diversity, right? You just don't none of those things matter. Come on, let's get on with life. And the end of the first one, we barely got through readjusting, but a couple of the affinity groups started to work, and people organized it so that we didn't follow through on our initial plan, but which was to have representatives from the first group decide what to do in the future, but rather to sort of slow it down and bring it to San Diego because I could no longer travel. And everybody came here. And the second time around, it was like some part of the way toward being able to work with each other and start the reorganization process. We all agreed at the beginning. Barbara, I think, was the one who made it as a procedure that we should identify the junior people around who have projects that they need to get done. And like affinity groups who are interested in that project would make them the leader of the project so that people kind of help them figure out what they could do and what they needed, essentially to support the more junior people. That in a fashion worked out over time. It got much more complicated, which it should, because nobody knew what it meant. But some of them started to work. And then the second meeting, instead of me and Barbara sitting at the front of the room and other people strung around and so on, Angela Booker and Alfredo were at the front of the room. And I was sitting in the back of the room, keeping my mouth quiet. And then it took directions I wouldn't have taken it. And we discovered stuff about small groups right there. We failed totally in the use of Zoom in the first meeting for a lot of reasons, technical reasons, other reasons, but it failed in a pretty spectacular way where it sort of caused problems, caused some suspicion, caused disappointment, whatever. And, but in the second one, we arranged to have the Zoom things be in small groups. That was our first small group thing, is to make Zoom work. So the Zoom people wouldn't feel left out, but then that allowed other people, the group sort of, not at random, but kind of mix the groups up. And after that meeting, things actually went, things started to turn because we had decided to do AERA the following year. We had things to do together. I had a thing I was doing with Anna Stetsenko and Auntie. People got interested in the idea of utopian methodology, which I brought from earlier work, thinking it's time for that idea to, that seems to have resonance now. I know much more than I did then. And a lot of people glommed onto that, and Auntie found all sorts of new literature that I found something, and he found something, and Annalisa was writing about it, and whatever. So that's a nice, interesting thing, and I've gone back because of that, and I've recovered my initial statements about what that project was supposed to be before it started, and I have all of my explanations of it for the first major project that we did, showing how my understanding is growing and my misunderstandings cause trouble, and very, but it's a self-criticism of look how it started, but certain of the procedures ended up with whatever ended up with around the fifth dimension. Now, how did I get started on that? Could you see things?
Tell us something about Region Project. That was
Well, that was something about so now we're at the point where we have to, this morning we met and we have to give a report in 5 100-word statements plus a 250-word abstract. And that's where we left it this morning, and we have to have it in by next Wednesday. So that's the way it's going. And we're looking at that in reorg. And then we're going to send it around to everybody because we're just doing this because here it is. And then beneath these 5 100-word summaries, trying to answer their questions the way they're asking it, we have links and other materials of stuff that people can look at. And then Eddie and his group have got a small grant to do analysis now of some of the features that obviously came out of that. So, there is a summer class that incorporates some of those ideas, I think, or it certainly has distance and stuff. And Auntie I think is participating some in that class. And there are plans now and talk about, well, what would we do going forward? And I started the coffee hour just because of the feeling at the end of the class, there were students who were coming from places where they didn't know, some had like engineering or something, they just didn't know. But in the class, there were all these seemingly knowledgeable people. So it took a long time for learners' voices to come out, and be made comfortable. And it took the class to do it. And that was a more restricted group in some ways. It didn't have as many senior people in it. And it was a very interesting community experience of design, but, and it came out the way it came out. It came out great, but not for everybody. And now the question is what will go forward. And that's what everybody's trying to discuss when they have time, because nobody has the damn time.
It's very interesting because as I was listening to Aiden and then to Mike talking about very similar processes, I found many connections. Like when you bring a heterogeneous group of people together, what happens first is that all these contradictions are being brought out, they emerge. There's a problem. It starts with a problem, and it's about trusting the process and kind of keeping going and not giving up on the idea of collaborating together. And a lot of it is the process of translation, of understanding these different perspectives. That's what I've noticed also in the Region project, that that was the most difficult thing. It's very difficult to actually listen to each other and then implement what you hear in your own actions, because people think that they are doing it right, but they are not. And it's part of the systemic thing. I think it's part of the system. It's part of a habitual way of organizing work together. So there is a lot of this continuously translating for each other. And after a while, people get it, actually.
Yeah. Everybody's saying the same thing in a different dialect.
Yes.
Not quite the same thing, because they're seeing the thing from a somewhat different angle. But they just, I keep saying my grandmother knew how to do this. She just did it and organized it in a different way. And in her understanding of it. Oh.
Hi, Ali.
Good to see you. Eddie, you're just one thing as an example. You gave an example of what I thought we would do in this class today. That is, you took my example of planting a seed with enough earth so it starts to grow and it gets watered, and it basically is in a little crack in a cement wall it's trying to bring down and make flowers bloom. And that little crack, when it starts to grow, that's your way in. That's your foothold. That's something like that. It's almost like a beachhead into a system. And now you look around and say, uh-oh, where did I land in the system? But that's your way in. And then you try to attach yourself to the system without losing yourself. You don't want to be eaten by it. That is, you don't want to be assimilated by it, chewed up and whatever. you want to stay whole, but you do want to interact with it because you're consuming parts of it. As you be able to let's call it internalization consumption. As you're eating that piece of your environment and taking it in, right? You yourself have an initial source of energy, and those two things can combine to give you new potentials for action. New little cracks that you actually now, smaller than you could get into before, this little tiny new root that's starting out from the root that you had was able to go into this really tiny crack you couldn't make it into. And so it's this, that's why I like that. I have it on my desktop. Am I allowed to close? Yes. Hold on just a second. I like this thing. Let me show did I hide it again? Oh, I've done that again. Let's see. Nuts. Okay. This is the second conversation where I put the darn thing, but it's done with kids who are immigrant kids, and it's gone viral, and you see it in various places where there's a picture of corn growing and the roots of corn going down, and they said they thought they could get rid of us, but they threw us in the dirt because they thought they could get rid of us. They didn't know we were seeds. And I think it's just that kind of insight about growing next generations that also causes paranoia. Those are parachute babies, right? So there's this double side of doing that. But I think, so there's an intuition that connected up about development that connects up with your own work. And it seems like that's a step up. So just in starting to have a little piece of a tool that comes in and say, oh, that one, that metaphor helps me to understand what I'm doing in this way. Eddie, how about one of these things that you're thinking about and trying to develop these ideas, or a question you have now where we are?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a panel that that's actually happening in like about 5 minutes, where Kris is going to be in there, Dr. Saper is going to be there, Naila is going to be there, Jose. So a lot of the PDS folks are planning to join, and it's called Imagining Social, Political, and Ethical Horizons of the Learning Sciences, Learning with and from Junior and Senior Scholars. And it just got me to thinking about the intergenerational work that has emerged from the Regen project through the affinity groups, as well as through the different conferences that we've had. I think over time, like if we've noticed, like, and I mean, I'm sure you have because you've written about it, but I've noticed that we've gotten closer to each other thanks to the technology mediated conversations that we have, but also through the person-to-person interactions that have emerged and the groups that have emerged based on research interests, et cetera. So that kind of collaboration, it has helped me understand how I can go into it in my own dissertation work, how I go into a system after school tinkering program in the San Francisco Bay Area and try to re-hyphen mediate some of those participation structures without like, because I'm still kind of, I mean, I've been there for 2 years, but it still takes a lot of work to like be considered one of the insiders. You come in a little bit as an outsider. So how do you move into the inside and then make change? So that movement from outsider to insider, participating in those practices, those have been challenging, and it takes a lot of time. But yeah, it means sitting in meetings with community members, teachers. So I like what Aiden was saying earlier, just like really working through those tensions and building networks within and across those spaces. So like bringing in other professors to help you. So yeah, those are just some thoughts I had. To the earlier conversation, I was excited to hear that, Aiden, you got to work with Gloria Lansing, Billings, and Yuria and Annalisa at the same time. That sounds like an amazing conversation, but I think that's the kind of work that we have to do is move, do intersectional work, right? To really push on these systemic issues. We have to bring in the learning sciences, cultural historical activity theory, and then also work in the critical social theory to really think about how these systems are being reproduced in the discourses of our students, the teachers, or in the participation structures, the whole social organization of learning in our spaces. And then last thing I'll say, I do have to, again, I apologize, I had to leave a little bit early because I do want to attend this session. Recently in the after school tinkering program, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're moving online. So it's created a whole entire new design challenge where we've dropped off materials to students, and they're going to be trying to build things as we teach them through webinar, Zoom webinar feature. But we're afraid, we don't want to do like the next step sequence type of pedagogy where we're like, oh, first do this, then put this together. But we really want them to explore and experiment with the materials that they have and to draw on their own technologies from home, tools and technologies that they may have from home to develop these projects. So we're excited to see what kind of ingenuity arises or we start to see from students. But we have our first session tomorrow, and I'm excited to write field notes and see how that goes. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of constraints to moving tinkering online. But I'm also excited about the possibilities. And I'm sure it'll be something that PDS can think about. How do we move tinkering and makerspaces online in this COVID-19 pandemic?
Eddie, would it be, I know you have to go. First of all, is this an open meeting? I mean, is anybody allowed to come, or do you have to be invited?
I think you had to register to the the ICLS conference, and then you could just join.
Yeah, well, I didn't do it. Be really interested. I hope there's some sort of recording so we can hear the discussion. Sounds great.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be. Jose is the one moderating, so I don't know if he's, so he might be the perfect person to reach out to about this. But I also wanted to attend because I wanted to take notes. So I'll take those notes and I'll forward if that'll be useful.
Well, why don't you say hi for us and ask if they'll post it later so that others can hear the discussion. We put it on Cultural Praxis.
I think.
Right?
Yep.
That would be great. We could set up a discussion forum around it if they want. So whatever they want, but that's clearly the same. It's a regen discussion going on now from the other side, which is great. And it's great that you guys will be there.
Yeah, and everyone there has been part of Regen in one way or another. So I'm excited to see what they have to say.
Yeah, no, this is like, and we'll get the Spencer thing out to you guys as quick as we can, because it's like vicious to have to say what we did in 500 words split into 5 questions. It's just like, it's insane, but make sure that it looks right. And for next week is kind of our last week unless somebody takes the initiative to make more weeks. So that's where we are with, we were going to go up to the 1st of July with this and then see what makes sense later on. So I'm happy to keep on interacting with all of you folks. That's fine with me. But what do we want to do? Just keep on going like this, or change, or I've said before, I could get people, we can get Annalisa or we can get people from around the world to come and talk about stuff. So Eddie, you could do something like show some video about the activities as they were before you ever did anything, and then maybe have a little demo of the kind of thing that you're trying to do, and then ask people what are some ideas that, just present your problem to a group of people who would just sit there and think with you about it, and you could try out how to explain and put into words what you wanted to be doing.
I'm happy to do that for next week.
Well,
or,
next week
or the one after.
Why don't we do it like a week after thing?
Yeah, the week after that. Yeah.
So I mean, if we keep it at an hour a week of people actually having to get together, then it's not a very big burden, and it should be an opportunity for people to go to people they trust, I hope, right? And say, here's what I'm trying to do, and here's how I'm thinking about it. What do you know? Who should I contact? We were just asking Julian to write something up about steps in doing something because other people weren't sure how you could do this particular kind of thing. So spread that knowledge. If we could keep it going somehow, it'd be very nice. I can't carry it, so I'm just busy handing it over.
We were just talking with Alfredo and Antti about the coffee hours and thinking about them as series. So this seemed to be a series about extending the class concepts or discussing concepts from class. And then we can come up with another series and another series.
And different people, right?
Yes.
Right.
So, and what would be a unifying element of these coffee hours would be intergenerational, sort of non-hierarchical, informal way of talking about it. Because
modeling.
Yes,
modeling.
because all these spaces that are part of academic, like typical academic
modeling.
teaching.
I'm pointing over here because Aiden's over here on my screen.
Yes.
Right, so it gets into it's like it's formally the same problem that you have, bringing all these different people together to get a new school made. We're trying to bring a bunch of people together because there's desperately needed new forms of education right at this level between people who don't have any help locally.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think it's a huge opportunity here.
Yes. Yes. So it's interinstitutional in that sense, because once you're part of the institution, still these hierarchical systemic structures are there. It's hard to, even no matter how much you try to avoid them or transform them, they're still there.
Right.
So it's nice that, let's say, Aiden is not a faculty in my department, so it's a different way of talking.
Great. One thing I'd love to see get into print somehow, maybe we could just do it as a collective note and put it on Cultural Praxis, is this insight that we arrived at. I arrived at, and I think you guys made it possible and arrived at it with me. Take off, Eddie. I know you got to go.
Okay, bye, Eddie.
We're going to try and reify this for you so you can read it. But the idea that going for a level playing field isn't just a do-gooder thing, right? That it's actually a principled thing that you want to do, because you can't hear all voices. You don't want it to be random voices. You want it to be patterned for a higher order of a more complex system of interaction, a higher collective process. I'm sorry. Ali, how are you doing? We've been chatting for longer, so you.
I've been doing well, thank you. So I was wondering about like this learning and development discussion.
Yes.
And I read like Vygotsky a long time ago now, but there was something about learning precedes development or development precedes.
Yes, learning precedes development.
Yeah, so I was wondering why, what that means and how that is, and why is that meaningful? Like, what difference does it make whether learning precedes development or?
It's a really fundamental question. It's a really good question. So when at the beginning of the 20th century, when you get a very strong developmental point of view, this is very strong in Piaget. And of course, Vygotsky is seen against the background of Piaget, sort of Piaget's social other or socio-cultural other equal. Not entirely correctly, but they're sort of like that. And Piaget made a big point of saying there's no point of teaching commutative relationships in arithmetic to a 3-year-old. They're not going to understand it because they haven't developed the intellectual resources yet to be able to deal with a problem of that sort. Okay? So from that point of view, first you have to develop the capacities to be able to learn something. Well, and there's some truth to that, right? I mean, you can't have a 5-year-old be a pole vaulter. It just doesn't going to work. So, you can't do it. On the other hand, if you follow that, it's sort of, especially if you don't have a theory of how experience in the world, which is what we usually call learning, like learning happens through experiences in the world. You don't have any theory of how that could change any process going on at all. It's like it's all preset by biology. And then experience, and that's the way Piaget we talk about it, it's like the food that experience is the food that feeds the organism to continue growing. So it's like very assimilative and very biological and juices kind of thing. Okay, well, what does that leave for a teacher to do? All right. Wait till the kid can learn it. I mean, you give them a test to see whether or not they're ready to learn it or not yet. something like that. So, and there's no theory of how those experiences from, we call cultural history, those experiences that are in your environment because you grew into a human environment, right? How do they in any way actually enter into and either promote some aspect of development or retard some aspect? How does that work? So a lot of people say, wait now, and Vygotsky came along and said, no, wait a second. All the time, people are learning all the time. I mean, little kids are forming reflexes, and they actually know they have very skeletal sorts of schemata that allow them to parse the world partially about what's going on as they're interacting with people. But for Vygotsky, things change fundamentally once you're born. You physically detach. I mean, he sort of has this is me using his ideas or independently coming to them and seeing that he had them before me and I just didn't know, right? But the basic thing is that at birth, there's this enormous discontinuity. You're disconnected from your sources of oxygen and your blood flow. Bingo, right? And so, and I said in one of these things that your blood actually starts to run the opposite direction when you're born. Blood flow reverses, right? And then you have a biologically prepared organism to meet a particular kind of environment. Now, if this was a particular, let's stick with that one. So in that environment, if they put you out on a rock and walk away, you're dead. You can't get up and follow them. You can't do anything. You're just dead. So it requires somebody to pick you up and hold you, keep you warm enough, give you enough food under the right conditions so you can keep growing. And that person isn't always there, right? That person kind of comes and goes. You can be with your mother a lot, but your mother goes to sleep. And not only that, but your mother has clothing on. Your mother may use a bottle. Your mother may strap you in various kinds of things, right? And all of that is now beginning to take the tender, if we're going to go back to now I'll mix metaphors again, but the tender shoots of development, the little buds of the little shoots that are coming up, that starts to bend them in particular ways, right? And I gave the example of like Japanese pear trees, where the tree grows up to this high, and then they bend it so it'll go along here, and then they'll pick two and have it go along here. So it creates a whole distributed arbor of pears hanging down, and then they come along with tissue paper and they wrap each pear up and they go through this whole incredible thing. But if they stopped working for a year, what would happen? Depending on how far out you got, out here, nothing is keeping them down this way, and all those sprouts that were coming up this way, they're just allowed to grow, and it's heliotropic, so it'll move toward the sun, right? It's very much like that way with development, except that this issue that at the very beginning you can really mold it in a variety of ways, but the more developed it gets, the less plastic it is, right? That kind of thing. So Vygotsky is saying is that what you want to do is you want to prepare the environment for development, and all of that preparation is the cultural organization of behavior. It's taking all of the experience and the resources from the past generations, built into all of the stuff you have around you, and it differs from different places, and that you become a full human being through acquiring all of those previous resources and becoming a member of the group that can now socioculturally reproduce the group, right? So it's like biological reproduction. You need culture up to the age where you have males and females who can reproduce, but they have to be able to reproduce or the game's over. And that's why it's intergenerational. And it's always, the future's always being pushed from the bottom. So it's just like the problem that we're facing. And that's why I say this principle of bring the beginning forward. And that relates to something that you can find in Catholic and Marxist ideas, right? But particularly in Catholicism, is the end has to be in the beginning. It's true in genetics, and it's true here. whatever you get, it has to be within the constraints of the genetic potential of the thing that gave rise to you in the first place. What things will create a good organism depend on the environment into which that seed grows, and what kind of environment it encounters. So seed and environment and organism, they're all part of a single life system. We don't deal with the life system, we deal with the human system and human activities. But it's not like the same principles don't apply, it's just that they're covered over with all of the marvelous coverings that humans have put on things to make them meaningful to them, because they're not by themselves meaningful in any way. So is that helpful? Right. So it's an optimistic way. Optimism turns bad when it becomes we know which way the future is. We know the direction of history. We have a science of history. We're not just going to do these utopian little socialist things. We're going to do the science of scientific socialism. If your science is right, if you can foretell the future, of human life, good luck to you. So you can find, again, if you ask me here, if Ivana reminds me, I have a couple of poems that I use a lot in all of this. And I learned them for the British anthropologist Jack Goody, who wrote a couple of great books, but Domestication of the Savage Mind is a great book about the role of literacy, writing, and schooling in human history and human thought. And he quotes T.S. Eliot, who was a Catholic poet, right? And about the end being in the beginning, and some of those things, and this is Jack Goody doing it. So there are some of these things that just seem like they're pretty close to the way things work at some level, and then we have to figure out, well, what's our place in all of this, and how do we not just be an invasive species that eats up our environment and then dies out? So that's all development. That's all. And the full Vygotsky program is an evolutionary theory, which I publish about and which I think is very hot right now. There's a lot of what's called a sort of neo-Lamarckian. It's not Lamarckian, but it looks like Lamarckian, and it comes from cultural mediation, and it has wide acceptance now of people a lot of people who never heard of Vygotsky or Lurie. And so that's like on that question, I think, and I keep emphasizing that what you're doing is so interesting. And did you get a chance to look at the literature as equipment for living?
Not yet, no. But
Please, for next week, do me a favor.
Sure.
I want to know what you think about it, because I think it's just exactly what you're going to want. And the question is, what kind of tool is it for what sort of thing? It's a very smart article. We've done an hour, which is shorter than usual, but we don't have as many people as we had before. Like that. There's a lot of potential here. With working with Eddie and his group, they're really nice guys. They're overwhelmed, but they're really nice people. So. And there will be more. I don't know exactly what, but Ivana will tell you if I don't answer the phone. Okay, I'm going to go off and do the rest of my life for a while, and I'll see you guys. And take care. And Ivana, I heard the birds earlier today too, but they seem to have quieted down in the sunshine. All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Likewise, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ellie.
Bye.
I know I didn't answer